everyone, and welcome back to Kids Church at Home. I hope you had a great time weaving on your looms last week. Our house is full of beautiful looms now, but I have to say all the biscuits from our temples have been eaten. Last week we finished the story of Samson, and we have one more story from the book of Judges in the Bible this week. But this story is a bit of a different one. It's not a story about a judge. And it's not a story about a great rescue either. It's actually the story of how bad things got when God's people didn't live with God as their boss. Do you remember how Adam and Eve were God's people in God's place with God as their boss, and things were great? But soon they swapped God's rules for their own ideas and their own rules, and life wasn't so great anymore. They actually had to leave God's place. It was a little bit the same with God's people when they came into the promised land. They were God's people in God's place. And when they lived with God as their boss, things were great. But we know from the stories that we've heard in Kids Church the last little while that the people of Israel swapped God for other pretend statue gods. And life wasn't so great anymore. Well, I've got a cooking show for you this week. And in our cooking show, you're going to meet a cook called Sophie. And Sophie is the kind of cook who likes to swap things in her recipes. And you'll see how that turns out. Hello, and welcome to Cooking with Sophie. I'm your host, Sophie Smith, and today we're going to be making chocolate crackles, one of my favourites. You'll see that I've got all the ingredients ready. I've got rice bubbles, I've got cocoa, I've got icing sugar, kofa, and coconut. But because I'm such an expert chef, sometimes I like to do things my own way. I like to do a few swaps here and there. You'll see what I mean. Today, you're going to get Sophie's special chocolate crackles. Now, as you know, the first ingredient is usually rice bubbles. But I thought, hey, why not use just normal rice? You can use plain boiled rice, or you could use raw rice straight out of the packet. It's up to you. Now, the next ingredient is cocoa. Now, this gives chocolate crackles their chocolatey taste. But cocoa, if you don't want to use it, that's fine, because cocoa sounds just like Coke. So you can use Coke instead of cocoa. And look, they're even the same brown colour. So it's really not going to make much of a difference. So pour in a splash of Coke. Oh, hear that fizzing? That's just what you want. Fantastic, basically the same. Pour it in and give it a bit of a mix around. And now the recipe calls for icing sugar, but you can also just use ice, fresh from the freezer. Here we go. And mix that right in. And maybe our camera crew can get a close-up of this because it is looking delicious. Now, last but not least, we've got an ingredient, kofa. Now, not everyone has kofa in their fridge. It's a bit of an unusual ingredient. And so, feel free, if you don't have any kofa, to just use coffee. Kofa, coffee. They basically sound the same. They'll do the same job. So, get a bit of coffee, a few spoonfuls, and mix it around again. And voila, it is smelling sensational, especially with that coffee. All right, and there you have it. One last thing to do, scoop it into the patty cases. Now, you want to do this carefully. You don't want to make too much mess, so just make sure that you're really watching what you're doing. And after we do this, there's only one step left. We just need to chuck it in the oven. Now, I know that usually when you're making chocolate crackles, they say to put it in the fridge. But everyone knows that you cook things in the oven. So I'm going to put mine in the oven, maybe for a good hour or so. If you want it really well done, you could do 2 hours, up to you. All right, it's time to get those chocolate crackles out of the oven, and I'm so excited. Just make sure you don't burn yourself. And look at that. They look amazing. Camera crew, come on down. Have a look. They look absolutely delicious. Amazing. Thanks so much for joining me on Cooking with Sophie. And just remember, cooking is always so much more fun when you follow your own recipe, when you do a few swaps. And we'll do more cooking next time. See you later. Ew. Would you want to eat any of Sophie's chocolate crackles? I think they looked pretty disgusting, and I reckon they would have tasted pretty gross as well. Sophie liked to swap things, didn't she? She liked to swap the real ingredients for her own ingredients, and it turned out pretty yucky. But God's people were the same, not with their cooking, but with God. They swapped the real God for pretend gods. They swapped God's good rules for their own rules. Do you remember some of God's good rules for his people? Here are some of them. Only worship God, the true God, not pretend ones. Don't make statues of God. Don't steal other people's stuff. And honour your parents. That means be respectful. When God's people followed those rules, life was great, like a delicious chocolate crackle. But when they swapped God for pretend gods, and when they swapped God's rules for their own rules, life wasn't so great, like Sophie's messy, burnt chocolate crackle. Well, you can see why God wanted to rescue his people. He wanted good things for them, but they kept on swapping them for bad. In your kids' pack this week, I have given you everything you need to make real chocolate crackles. So I hope you follow the recipe, not like Sophie, and that you have a most delicious morning tea. See you later, guys.